We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Greetings from Tbilisi, Georgia. This is Burn, the Anadromist. Today what we're going to do is continue our discussion on symbolism with the works of Andrei Tarkovsky, particularly some of his writings on the subject and some of his answers to various interviewers in his lifetime. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about my influence from Tarkovsky, how much he's affected my own thinking. I highly recommend his book, Sculpting in Time, which has been a book which really affected me, although not quite as much as his films have. Just to remind you, last time in the video called Layers of Symbolism, what I did was I looked at it really is layers of symbolism. Part of the reason I call it that is because of my discovery of Tarkovsky. Something in what he's doing to me gets to a further layer below many other layers. And I want to try to convey this. So, one layer of symbolism has to do with just the things we use every day. We don't even think of them as symbols, like money, numbers, letters, language is all symbolic. And the symbol being things that represent something else or go beyond, certainly beyond any obvious, shall we say, materialistic meaning. There are also things which can kill symbols in our culture. Our culture is unique in creating these things. That is to say, in the past, torture kills the symbolic. I mean, that is to say, it actually kills humanity. It is the kind of thing, Hans Ruckmacher once said that there's a reason most fairy tales have an old woman with who is a witch or some kind of crone figure who is doing the dark diabolical deeds. It's something in the nature of the old woman, the way she looks, that we use this image. But he said it's much worse if it's a young, beautiful woman, because we're destroying the image of the old woman now and destroying it. And if you were to be tortured by a young, beautiful woman, I mean, physically tortured and humiliated, you've entered a completely different realm where now you've destroyed the traditional images, the old woman who lives in a cabin in the woods, Hansel and Gretel, that kind of thing. And you've replaced it with the young woman. In other words, you've gotten rid of the traditional image and thrown it out for what? Well, that's what propaganda and commercialism and just our basic materialistic philosophy has done. Is it's basically said, all these images, they're just up for grabs, so we can replace them with whatever we want to replace them with. It's, ironic. That is so funny. It's transgressive. We use these kind of words, not thinking what we're doing to the images we're using, which then creates a kind of chaos of images. This might be a good subject for a little bit later. Somehow this is turning into a series. I didn't really mean it to. I thought I could handle it all in the first one. But part of it is I was reading some of the material here by Tarkovsky, and I found myself engaging in a kind of dialogue with it. And I thought, maybe what I should do is actually engage in the dialogue process with you as I'm reading some of these discussions. So in a sense, I cannot, Tarkovsky died around 1987. I cannot bring Andrei Tarkovsky to you. because he's dead. But I can bring his words to you. And we can have, I found someone who had found quite a few of the quotes of him wrestling with the subject of symbolism. And if you remember in my last video, which I highly recommend you go back and watch, there's the link right there. If you want to catch up to the conversation, Tarkovsky essentially is saying in his works, these aren't, my works aren't symbolic. To which I'm saying, oh, you got women floating around. You've got dogs mysteriously prowling everywhere. You've got the stalker walking through the maze. What are you talking about? Well, actually, I know what he's talking about. He's saying many things, but one thing he's not saying is it's certainly not an allegory for anything. And in fact, we'll argue with Tarkovsky in a minute. I think before we do that, what I'd like to do is tell you how I discovered Tarkovsky's work, and then what it has meant to me, a little bit of that, and then go from there. Now, I'm not going to break down who Andrei Tarkovsky is. He did 7 films because it was so difficult to get films made during the Soviet era. He did 7 official films. He's got a couple of student films. His great films include Solaris, Andrei Rublev, Stalker, my all-time favorite, but then again, Andrei Rublev isn't very far away. Nostalgia, Sacrifice, Jeepers, I'm almost there. Ivan's Childhood, or My Name is Ivan. And what's the last one? Burn. Oh, The Mirror. How can I forget that? That was considered his most personal film. So, yeah, but I'm not going to go into how these were made. So many people have done videos on Tarkovsky that there's no point in me going back and hashing over all this stuff. People have dissected his amazing tracking shots. I mean, one of the great things I love about Tarkovsky is how he will just linger over things to a degree where you start to almost get a real-time experience of the environment of the film. But I first encountered Tarkovsky when Stalker was brought to New York City in what was it, around 1983, 84. It was brought to the Film Forum before it moved to its classic location back when it was, I can't remember the street, but it was in a much smaller building. And I remember watching that, and I was with a friend of mine, an artist, John Pomara, and we both watched that, and we came out going like, that was really interesting. I felt like something had gotten into me. I'd never seen a film like that before. I really liked it. But I didn't walk out saying to myself, oh, this is the best film I ever saw. I mean, Tarkovsky's films are long and slow and take time to unravel. I believe I saw Nostalgia next, which by this time I was really starting to get into really starting to appreciate Tarkovsky. And this was when the film was released. It was about, 1985, 86. And around that time, the Thalia Theater in New York was having a showing of what at that time was the longest version of Andrei Rublev. Now, many of Tarkovsky's films, Andrei Rublev and Solaris being the most obvious, have had horrendous histories of editing and butchering by various people. And I'm not going to go into all of that, but it's kind of fascinating. But what I did was I decided to go up and watch Andrei Rublev. Probably, 40 minutes shorter than the version that I like the most now. I mean, it's still about 2.5 hours long or longer, maybe 3 hours.
Посмотреть пришел.
Все-то она, родная, терпит. Все вытерпит. Долго так еще будет. Послушай, что же такое делается?
За грехи наши и зло человеческий облик приняло. Бог-то простит, только ты себе не прощай. Андрей. Слышь, Андрей.
I remember the feeling of watching that film because of the journey of the icon painter, Andrei Rublev, was so... it's in some sense mirrored my life on some strange level. It was having gone through this experience. He goes through these different experiences in life, finally takes a vow of silence, and at the end is awakened to it by the struggles of this young bell maker, that there is a reason to go on with things. And I would say that film actually did that to me in some sense. It awakened my, I was a Christian, but I'd gone through various things. The group I was in had become cultish. Then I'd gone to Libri in Switzerland, which was a great reawakening of my faith. But also I suddenly realized, things are much more serious, and you can't take these things and put them into ideological boxes. But anyway, I remember walking out of that film. My brain was like swimming with things. I felt someone had just said, "Oh, did you want to go to the Middle Ages?" and just taken me by the scruff of the neck and pushed me in and said, "Good luck." With no explanation ahead of time. It was here they are talking these weird things about icons, and there was just something about the whole thing. I just felt like I was in a completely different world, a real world though. It was no fantasy world. This wasn't someone's recreation of, some space kingdom. It wasn't this kind of fantasy thing. It was real. It was just, and it was like this thing just helped make me alive in some sort of crazy way. And I remember walking, the theater was at I believe it was 96th Street in New York. And I got out and I just started walking blocks and blocks thinking about this thing. It was at 42nd Street, so that many blocks had passed when I finally found a telephone booth and called a friend and said, who did I call? I can't remember, but I called a friend and said, "You won't believe the film I just saw." And just started to, it was just it's rare that I've had an experience like that with a film. Shortly thereafter, I resaw Stalker. And wow, this time it really hit me what Stalker was about. And for a long time, Andrei Rublev was the greatest film in my life, but slowly Stalker kind of passed it. Then I saw Sacrifice, which my feeling about Sacrifice is it is a great film still, but it helps if you've seen some other Tarkovsky films. That is to say, it's him kind of concluding things. He knew by the end of that film that he was dying. He had cancer. And sadly, he did die before the film was, I believe, even released. Around that time, also, his book, Sculpting in Time, came out. By this time, I read it, and I could get it. I was fully in the Tarkovsky universe at this time. By this time, I had seen probably Mirror. I was looking for everything I could get. And eventually I saw, I remember there was a theater in New York City that showed the most butchered version of Solaris you can imagine, where it literally was in Russian with subtitles, and then for a half hour or so it was in English. Just a bad translation with like bad grainy print, and then it went back to Russian. Very bizarre. You are so fortunate if you can see a Tarkovsky film. Eventually I saw Stalker enough. I think it was about the fifth or sixth time I'd seen it in the theaters, that I went with a Russian friend of mine, Sergei, and we went there. We came out. It was like a new print. We came out, and he looked at me and said, I can understand why you want to see this, but what are these other people doing here? They obviously don't understand it. In other words, there's a kind of a hip way of looking at Tarkovsky, a way of seeing him almost exclusively on the surface without dropping in too far. And that mode was already beginning to be revealed to the world, that there was, one didn't have to see Tarkovsky in all his glory. One could just see him as a great stylist. Eventually, I would pick up things like Tarkovsky's diaries, and there are books of his interviews, books of his Polaroids. It's almost a literary industry of books writing about Tarkovsky now. But alas, he died at the age of 57. And my feeling is, man, he had more films in him. It never came out. But I am grateful for what we have. Very, very grateful. And, now I'm 64. I'm older than Tarkovsky is. And I still look up to him as being like, this guy. So, one of the things that happened was, as I read his books, it was even before I read his books, the images in his films, and I specifically mentioned dogs, because he has a dog in almost every one of his films. And there's something about seeing that dog that sparked in me, and this is ironic considering this was before I read his book, sparked in me a memory, my first memory that I can remember. And it was a memory of myself as a child. There's an old white house with white wood on the side. It's in Seattle, Washington. There's snow on the ground. The sky is kind of dark, almost purple, and there's a black dog. Now, the thing about that is, later in life, dogs became quite frightening for me, partly because as I eventually ended up living in California, to get places, there would often be dogs barking at you, particularly crossing this one hill from valley to valley. But this dog reminded me of something else. It was like this deep image about dogs. And Tarkovsky taps into that. It wasn't his dog I saw, but his dogs reminded me of my dogs, the good and the bad. And I thought, that's what he's trying to do. And then later, when I read his book, he mentions the idea that the importance of our first memories. And he says, if someone tells you of their first memories of life, you can say with pretty much certainty that you know something about this person, something really true about this person. And so, but I saw the way Tarkovsky was dealing with images was very different than the way most people dealt with images, even most, artistic filmmakers. And so it really set off these resonances, and I started to think about my own personal, highly symbolic, Mr. Tarkovsky, relationship to dogs. Now, as I pointed out in the last video, Tarkovsky, well, let me go over some of the, let's talk about Tarkovsky's rejection of symbolism and what his rejection kind of inspired in me. I say rejection because I don't think he really rejected it, but he did reject something. He said, I read this last time, but it's a good place to start. So he said, I had the greatest difficulty in explaining to people that there are no hidden coded meanings in the film, and that is the film Mirror. He says, nothing beyond the desire to tell the truth. Often my assurances provoked incredulity, even disappointment. Some people evidently wanted more. They needed arcane meanings and symbols, secret meanings. They were not accustomed to the poetics of the cinema image, and I was disappointed in my turn. Such was the reaction of the opposition party in the audience. Now, in Russia, the Soviet period, there was always this political intrigue attached to everything. As for my own colleagues, they launched a bitter attack on me, accusing me of immodesty, of wanting to make a film about myself. Also a big sin in the Soviet era, where we were all supposed to be in this together, to make something about yourself was kind of embarrassing. So I talked about that last time. So here's Tarkovsky saying, there's no symbols in the film. Now, I believe he's telling the truth. That is to say, well, and then I start thinking about things like, for instance, the very last image in Sacrifice, his very last film, shows a young boy kind of laying down with his head against a tree that's a dead tree planted, and he goes up the tree, and the tree's dead branches kind of go like this, forming a crucifix. And the boy's last words in the film is, in the beginning was the Word. He's talking to his dead father. Why was that, Father, Papa?
I begynnelsen var ordet. Varför det, pappa?
Yeah, it's kind of highly symbolic if you ask me. But I know what Tarkovsky is saying. For one thing, one of the things that Tarkovsky is saying is that at that time in the Soviet Union, people looked for allegories in everything. And I really found this when I was, researching puppetry in the former Eastern Bloc countries, former Soviet satellite countries, that the only way to communicate was through allegory, highly symbolic allegory, which the censors were always too thick-headed to really see. That's one of the problems with being a censor. It kind of dulls your senses to things. Tarkovsky was asked what he thought about Ingmar Bergman, the great Swedish film director, who, Ingmar Bergman has death playing chess with the knight in The Seventh Seal. No symbolism there. But here is what Tarkovsky says about Ingmar Bergman. Tarkovsky says that he has a horror of tags and labels. I don't understand, for instance, how people can talk of Ingmar Bergman's symbolism. Far from being symbolic, he seems to me, through an almost biological naturalism, to arrive at the spiritual truth about human life that is important to him. And again, Ingmar Bergman, symbolism. Yeah, it's there. But why is Tarkovsky saying it's not? Because he's pointing at something else. I am sure if Tarkovsky were here today and I was to ask him about the rather crucifix-looking tree at the very end of the sacrifice and those words, what he would also point to is the tree. I am sure that what he would say to me is, yes, but what I really wanted to show you is the tree. And I think he would mean that. That is to say, he wouldn't be cleverly disguising. In other words, he's not just showing you this kind of gnarly crucifix of a tree at the end of that film to show you the crucifix. He's also showing you the gnarly crucifix of a tree to show you the old gnarly crucifix of a tree. That is to say, he wants you to see that image. an image you might see just walking down the road through an apple orchard, during the fallow season, where you would see these, sometimes the way people train their apples and such is, you get these like crucifix-like shapes. And yes, he's pointing towards Christ. He is an Orthodox Christian. But no, he's not simply saying that. He is also saying, do you see the bark of the tree? Do you see the way it moves? Do you see the growth over the sections that have been cut off? He's showing you the tree. And this is what I think he also means when he talks about Ingmar Bergman and the whole concept, he says, almost biological naturalism. Because Bergman really loved Tarkovsky films. Bergman thought Tarkovsky was one of the few great directors in the world, which is really, it was nice they had a mutual admiration society. And Bergman later helps him out and gives him Sven Nykvist to help him film Sacrifice. But the point is that Tarkovsky is on to something else here. It's the same with his dogs. He's not showing you the dogs as a symbol. He's showing you the dog and showing you how deep that image is. And this is a hard thing for people living today to understand, because we have learned to essentially blind our eyes to images. Every time you pick up a phone and look at it, all that junk you're looking at is some of the most destroyed imagery imaginable. It is just simply graphic nonsense. It is just there for utilitarian convenience, and takes you away from being able to see real things. I mean, anyone who thinks they've seen art after seeing it on a computer has no conception whatsoever what art is. You didn't see, there's no such thing as a virtual tour of the Louvre. You didn't go to Chartres Cathedral by seeing it online. This is just a complete fabrication. So even images that do have some resonance and depth, it's very hard to see them in the world we have created. And we've created this world because we believe, or at least our science, more importantly, our technology, more importantly, our commerce has told us everything is essentially dead imagery. We can do whatever we want to with it. It doesn't mean anything. It's just stuff. Whereas Tarkovsky is saying, look at your dog again. Look at that tree again. I mean, the reason that Jesus hung on a tree is partly because he was supposed to, in a symbolic way, hang between heaven and earth. But the point is, it was on a tree. And if you don't get that, you're missing the story. That is to say, it has to be on the grain of a tree. And we have to see the importance of what a tree is. And a tree is more than any of the parts of its function. It's more than our symbolic understandings of the tree. It is a tree. It is. And that's what Tarkovsky is pointing to. But that is highly symbolic in a different sort of way. In other words, what I'm saying, in my understanding, you don't have to agree with me, but there are these layers of symbolic. And what Tarkovsky is mining is, while other people are at the top, or while everyday life we're using money, which is a highly symbolic transaction that we hardly ever think about, or we're using, math, which is also a highly symbolic transaction we don't think about, or we're using all sorts of social codes and manners, also highly symbolic transactions, or maybe we're involved with, as a Christian, I see all sorts of symbolic relationships between, Jonathan Peugeot has a great discussion of the Garden of Eden, most likely being on some sort of a hill, on a mountain, and how the fall was also a fall down the hill. And there's a reason, because the mountain as an image suggests all sorts of things. It's also, the mountain as an image isn't heaven. It is our closest approach to heaven, that is to say. So these are the symbolic things. But where Tarkovsky is like, he's in a mine somewhere, digging further down. And what he's doing is he's saying, yeah, but before you get to anything else, it's a mountain. And he means that in the fullest way possible. It inspires everything else. It inspires, of course, climbers, but it isn't just a recreational opportunity. I once remember in Alaska, I'd been there for a couple of years, and I knew some of the people who worked in the raft guiding world and also did mountain climbing and stuff. And I remember talking to this one woman whose husband was a guide, and she also did guiding. And I just said to her, the strange thing to me is how people here have a difficulty seeing nature as much more than, an opportunity for physical recreation. It's a place to recreate. It's recreation. It's not the thing itself. Whereas my experience of that same place was, oh my goodness, there's so much more there than just a sports opportunity. So anyway, and she, of course, looked at me just with horror because I had just, in kind of a word, just destroyed her relationship to nature, because that's how thin it was. She hadn't gone any further. Whereas Tarkovsky points you further. Let's go on with some other things Tarkovsky said. He says here, a literary work, now these are all quotes so far in the book, Sculpting in Time. He says, a literary work can only be received through symbols, through concepts, for that's what words are. But cinema, like music, allows for utterly direct, emotional, sensuous perception of the work. I know what he's saying. Do you get it? He's basically saying that, for instance, as you're reading, you're processing all these symbols. The words are symbols and such. And he's right. So he's talking, in a sense, he's looking at the Susanna Langer kind of definition of symbols, our symbol-making equipment. And then he says, but cinema, like music, allows for utterly direct, emotional, sensuous perception of the work. Now, the one thing he didn't mention there is the painting, which I think he would put that in the same category as music. It's just a direct, it's the thing itself, you see. Now, I agree with him. There is a difference. But here is where I would start to question something here. But let's stay with him for a second here. So, what is it? The Hans Ruckmacher makes a very interesting point. He has in his discussions on art that he did, almost not related to it, but certainly related, was a discussion he did on scholarship. And he made 4 points. And the first point was that nothing is certain. And he certainly meant scholarship, all the stuff we can study and investigate, nothing is certain. But then point 2 is many things are certain. Like the sun rising tomorrow morning. Like me if I step out of this building and I'm going to fall, hitting the ground. The fact that we take in things with our eyes, that spring comes every year. But he also said that paintings are in that category. That is to say, the painting itself is in the category of absolute certainty. Why? It exists. And our uncertainty comes with trying to understand the painting. But the painting, and he's also put God in this category, it's just things that exist. Now, you can disagree whether God exists or not, but that's a different discussion. But nevertheless, that's how he put it. By the way, the next 2 points were, what was the next one? The difficulty of communication, and finally, the possibility of communication. That we actually can, everyone sees these things with different colored lenses. And you have to admit the color of your lenses. And lastly, the miracle is that we can actually talk to each other, recognizing, that so-and-so saw this through this lens, and they came out with that idea, and my friend told me about it, but I know he always mixes that up, and therefore, there you go. So, but that's Ruckmacher. Put Ruckmacher over there. But what Tarkovsky is saying essentially is that the cinema is a thing. That is to say, when you see a movie, and he compares it to music for a good reason, both of them take place in time. Unlike a painting, which is just sitting there on the wall, the movie you can only really experience as it's unfolding. So it hits you directly, which also means that if someone's got something devious to do with that, it can get you while you're not really thinking about it. And that's true for music as well. I mean, that's what's happened to pop music in the 21st century. The 20th century was almost this battleground of musical styles, which ends up with essentially the pop industry winning. We'll save that for a really big discussion someday. But now people know how to encircle you with music, and so that you're just simply, kind of enslaved by it. But that's because it hits you directly. But guess what? All those musical notes are symbols. Symbols of what? Well, nothing specific. That is to say, a minor chord doesn't equal sorrow, although some people try to say that. There are really happy minor chord songs, particularly in Eastern Europe. But likewise, in the cinema, the images are all symbolic. Every one of them has filled and loaded with symbolism. But what he's trying to point to you is the fact that it's a thing itself. And we're not going to talk too much about music, but let's go on. He says also in the book, art must carry man's craving for the ideal, must be an expression of his reaching out towards it. That art must give man hope and faith. And the more hopeless the world in the artist version, the more clearly, perhaps, we see the ideal that stands in opposition. Otherwise, life would become impossible. Art symbolizes the meaning of our existence. So he's saying art symbolizes the meaning of our existence. What he's done is a very interesting thing. He's not talking about the symbols of art. He's talking about art as a symbol. That art essentially symbolizes that struggle of hope, struggle of faith, to believe in things, to understand things. That doesn't mean art doesn't have despair sometimes. And in fact, some of the greatest art is created out of great moments of conflict because, as he says here, otherwise life becomes impossible. We use art for that reason. So for him, art is a symbol. It symbolizes the meaning of our existence. So one thing Tarkovsky is not doing is he's not talking about he's not talking about the symbols in art. He's talking about art as a symbol. And I think this is important to understand what he's doing here. So, let me go on here. There was a book that came out in Poland that had a lot of discussions about Tarkovsky's interviews and his discussions. And I'm going to read some of that from that. These are translations. He says, these are Tarkovsky's responses to interviewers about these things. So Tarkovsky says, we can express our feelings regarding the world around us either by poetic or descriptive means. I prefer to express myself metaphorically. Let me stress, metaphorically, not symbolically. A symbol contains within itself a definite meaning, certain intellectual formulas, while metaphor is an image. An image possessing the same distinguishing features as the world it represents. An image, as opposed to a symbol, is indefinite in meaning. One cannot speak of the infinite world by applying the tools that are definite and finite. We can analyze the formula that constitutes a symbol, while metaphor is a being within itself. It's a monomio. It falls apart at any attempt of touching it. Now, here's what I'd like to do, is I'd like to contrast what Tarkovsky is saying here with what Juan Eduardo Sirlot says in his preface to the Dictionary of Symbols that I discussed last time. Sirlot says the whole point of real symbolism is that you can't grab onto it as a simple, it's not a this equals that. And he really breaks down the difference between the allegory, which really is a this equals that, versus the symbol, which is a this is kind of like that. This is where Tarkovsky, I think, is actually talking about allegory. Like I said, he's in the Soviet Union. The only way to communicate is through allegories. Tarkovsky doesn't really use allegories the way that, I showed a bit of The Wishing Tree by the Georgian Tengiz Abuladze last time. And he's speaking, I would say, in good part in allegory, but he's also speaking symbolically. So he's speaking allegorically when he has the young, beautiful woman who is tortured by her Russian husband. It's just like that's a clear case of the young woman represents Georgia. The Russian husband represents Russia and the Soviet Union and their history. That is a clear allegory. Whereas the whole discussion of the nature of beauty within that film, which is very definitely there, and its lack of fitting into this world of imperfection, is very highly symbolic. Now, so I would use Sirlot's definition to correct Tarkovsky here. If Tarkovsky was here, I would say, but Andrei, you're talking about allegory, not symbol. Now, he would probably come back with me and this idea of the image. So what I think is happening in my discussion with Tarkovsky here is that he is essentially reacting to a world in which everything is an allegory. I'm saying, yeah, but the real symbolism is fluid. It accrues meaning. So, what is the symbolism of the color orange? I decided to look up color symbolism on some silly YouTube video, a couple of them. And they were both just like, orange is a happy color. Orange represents, and it was just kind of like, I guess they're just looking at oranges, because they were, and they were going like, pumpkins are happy. No, pumpkins are dark. Why do you think we put pumpkins with black for Halloween? Actually, orange is kind of a death color too, because it represents the falling leaves, which represent the end of the season, and a dying and a falling. So that's why orange and black together are like an ultimate dark combination. There's something about that combination. So, but no, if you just see it as, this is that, this same one was like, red is passion and blood. Well, no, that's not all it is. Why do you think red is good luck in Chinese? Red and gold is the good luck combination in Chinese. But it doesn't mean, the red and gold don't mean good luck to me. It's in China, they mean good luck. In other words, symbols aren't simply this equals that thing, that very specific concept. They're always fluid. They're always building, and some symbols get forgotten. Like I said, people, nowadays you'll hear, and this is one of the things that kind of irks me about some of the symbol conversation now, is people are suddenly bringing in symbols from here and there. Well, they've read too much Jung or something. So they're talking about the universality of the mandala. Really? I mean, I grew up in California in the 1960s, 70s. There was no mandalas, except that hippies were bringing them in from the East, but in general life in the West, the mandala was not much of a thing. You would get things like the rose windows, but that's the Middle Ages, and that's not a mandala in the same sense. So, because these things aren't this equals that really specifically all the time. The world is symbolic, and some symbols, like I was just talking about Jonathan Peugeot's mountain in the Garden of Eden, I think are much more solid. That is to say, the image of a mountain is very solid. But it's interesting to me that when I was talking about orange, well, orange is also used as like the robes of the Hare Krishnas. Well, maybe though there is some relationship to my conception of death and their conception of life. I just posit that. But I think part of the problem with symbols is you can't really specify them. Now, people who think you can are really talking about allegory, and that's what I would say of Tarkovsky. However, he's talking about this thing called the image. Here's another thing he said related to the image. He says, an image cannot become a symbol, in my opinion. Whenever an image is turned into a symbol, the thought becomes walled in, so to speak. It can be fully deciphered. That's not what an image is. A symbol is not yet an image. A symbol is not yet an image. Although image cannot be explained, it expresses truth to the end. Its meaning remains unknown. I was asked once what the bird on the boy's head in the mirror meant. But anytime I attempt to explain, I notice everything loses its meaning. It acquires a completely different sense than intended, moves away from its rightful place. I could only say a bird would not come to an evil man, but that's not good enough. A true image is an abstraction. It cannot be explained. It only transmits truth, and one can only comprehend it in one's own heart. Because of that, it's impossible to analyze a work of art by utilizing its intellectual significance. Now, I can see what he's saying here is that, and as a person who both says things critically, as I am now, but I also create works of art. Here, let me show you a little something of a work of art that I created. Okay, I think Tarkovsky would agree with me that that was purely an image and had nothing to do, you can't pull it apart. However, I would say this, that image, that artistic image, is highly, highly, highly symbolic. And it's below the realm of where we talk about, the relationship of the crucifix to the telephone pole kind of image, where we see these alliances and, what's the T square represent? What is the, and how does that connect to the scarecrow and other T type of, and there certainly is a great deal to be said about these things, but that's not what Tarkovsky is talking about. And as soon as you pull it apart, you end up pulling apart the art as well. However, I would say this, and maybe sometime I'll do an entire, kind of discussion on the nature of the difference between intuition in art and exploration, intellectual exploration in art. Intuition is you just get an idea, like for instance, I like scarecrows. So maybe I'll show you an image of a scarecrow. Okay. That's my artistic image for you. Here's my scarecrow. And I would put certain things on it that I see. And then I look at it after I'm done and I go like, gosh, I could do that better next time, because we always do. Or I could do it differently. Oh, I didn't quite do what I wanted to do. That's the nature of art. You create something and then you look at it a little bit later and you go like, I didn't quite do what I wanted it to do. Which is why every time any artist looks at their work, they immediately say to themselves, yeah, it pretty much does. Yeah. And then they put it aside and they go on to the next thing. And then they come back and look at it and they're like, not really. And then occasionally they'll go back and they go, I think that did do what I was trying to do. But meanwhile, what they'll do is they will start digging into understand. It's just like, meanwhile, the person is sitting there looking at more images of scarecrows. Yeah, me, personally, I do this all the time. Anytime I see an image of a scarecrow, which is an image I obviously love, I go and I look at it some more. I obviously have looked at, thousands of images of puppets. I've seen hundreds of hours of puppet theaters, puppet shows. I've seen hundreds of hours of puppet films. Does that mean when I come to create a puppet show, none of that is incorporated? Of course it all is. But you almost get to, the way I look at it is you put out your intuitive idea, you go back, you do a bit more research and such. Then you put your next intuitive idea down, which includes some of whatever you were thinking before. In other words, you've reached a new layer of intuition. And I think this process goes on and on throughout art. Someday I'll discuss this. But I think what Tarkovsky is afraid of is breaking that image down. Now, here's the thing. If I present an image to you, if Tarkovsky presents an image to you, if you cannot get to the bottom of it any more than you can get to the bottom of walking through a forest. It's the same kind of thing, because there's always more to look at. It's fractal. It goes in and in and in. I would say to him, I think that the artistic image is a highly mysterious thing. And I think he would agree with me, because you can't fully define it. But that's everything in life. You can't fully define anything. That's why a dog or a cat is such a mysterious thing. I think one of the most interesting things is people have dogs and cats around them, and they don't recognize how mysterious these creatures are. They just think like, yeah, a dog's supposed to be a pet. Cat's supposed to be a cat. They treat them in cute ways, which is really, to me, as Roger Scruton says, kitsch is a disease of faith. When you take animals and make them into these cute little kitschy things, you ruin the mystery of them. And to me, the most valuable thing is to preserve the mystery. So in all my relationships, like for instance, I have a cat that comes to my window all the time. Don't think that cat comes to my window and I look at him like, oh. Why? Because he's a cat. He's not a cute little cuddly creature with big eyes. That's our problem. We have a disease of faith, as Roger Scruton says. So let me go on with more discussions from Tarkovsky. He says, I am an enemy of symbols. Symbol is too narrow a concept for me in the sense that symbols exist in order to be deciphered. An artistic image, on the other hand, is not to be deciphered. It is the equivalent of the world around us. Rain in Solaris is not a symbol. It is only rain, which at certain moment has particular significance to the hero, but it does not symbolize anything. It only expresses. This rain is an artistic image. Symbol for me is something too complicated. And I would agree. Now, the rain in that film is very interesting. And in fact, here's the point. If you watch enough Tarkovsky's films, you will see dripping water and rain all over the place in the film. And what he's really saying is that this has a meaning for me so deep that I can't express it. But I don't believe him when he says I am an enemy of symbols. I think what he's saying is, I would like to have heard from him actual examples of things he considered to be symbols. Because I am sure that we would agree on many ways. What he's doing is he's pointing to the image, and I'm saying the image is like resonating. It's like glowing with this symbolic, meaningful quality. The very fact that you can't define it doesn't mean it's not symbolic. But I think what the image does to us, this kind of image he talks about, the image that comes from anything, is that it feeds us in some sort of strange way. And I really mean that. That is to say, I'm not talking metaphorically here at all. That is to say, without images, without, a proper relationship, ecological, you could call it, human relationship to colors and textures and faces and animals and trees and, all of this stuff. The more the modern world or postmodern world, well, the modern world makes everything straight and angular. The modern world straightens things out. The postmodern world makes it all a joke. It makes it into an ironic supposition, a deconstruction, a social construct that can be simply, all these things can simply be replaced with other things. Everything can be funny. Everything can be a joke. And I just don't think so. And believe me, I believe in humor, but that's a different story. And that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about this specific kind of irony that people have today, particularly in the Western world, of talking about everything. And one of the things I like about being in Georgia is that people here have kind of like a sense of bonhomie, but they're not like, they laugh, they like absurdities and things, but they're not always making these absurd, ironic cultural references. And I feel just wonderful about that. I feel like, these are great. Because for me, I saw that increasing as I was growing up. This more and more ironic take on everything. Tarkovsky says, I'm constantly being asked what this or that means in my films. It's unbearable. An artist does not have to be accountable for his intentions. I did not do any deep thinking about my work. I don't know what my symbols mean. Aha. He just said it. He doesn't know what his symbols mean. They are there, though. That's the point. This is me having a discussion with Tarkovsky. I only desire to induce feelings, any feelings, in the viewer. People always try to find hidden meanings in my films. But wouldn't it be strange to make a film while striving to hide one's thoughts? My images do not signify anything beyond what they are. We do not know ourselves that well. Sometimes we express forces which cannot be grasped by an ordinary measure. I completely agree. And trust me, when I make my more creative artistic productions in life, whether it even be in stories and such, there are things going on there that I don't fully understand, but I feel like I need to somehow express them. Tarkovsky in another interview. Mysterious elements in my films? I think people somehow got the idea that everything on screen should be immediately understandable. In my opinion, events of our everyday lives are much more mysterious than those we witness on screen. If we attempted to recall all events, step by step, that took place during just one day of our life, and then showed them on the screen, the result would be 100 times more mysterious than my film. Stalker, he's talking about. Audiences got used to simplistic drama. Whenever a moment of realism appears on screen, a moment of truth, it is immediately followed by voices declaring it confusing. Many think of Stalker as a science fiction film, but this film is not based on a fantasy. It is realism on film. Try to accept its content as a record of one day in the lives of three people. Try to see it on this level, and you'll find nothing complex, mysterious, or symbolic about it. Yeah, well, Stalker is about three men going to a room where you will have the deepest desire of your heart granted to you. And then discovering that maybe that's not such a good thing, because what's really the deepest desire of our heart, you don't really want to know. So, yeah, well, it just simply taken as that, it sounds very just straightforward. And yet, of course, that film is, I'm sorry, Andrei, that's a mysterious film. It can be understood, but first he is saying you have to learn to accept things. And I think that what he is pointing to is a world which is more mysterious than we learn to accept. So what he's really saying, I think we agree. I think if we were talking, we would eventually agree that, because both of us are saying the world is completely mysterious outside of us, that science has made an error. That's the whole point of the scientist character in the movie Stalker. He's made an error of seeing the world through this reductionist lens, and the only thing he can think of doing is, if this room really does exist, we should blow it up. But even that, in the end, he's going like, oh, it doesn't do anything. He brings his materialist viewpoint back. Tarkovsky goes on in another essay and says, I never create allegories. I create my own world. That world does not signify anything unusual. It just exists. It has no other meaning. I think symbol and allegory rob the artist. Creator brings up images which reveal life in it, the way it is. They are not Aesop's fables. This manner of working would be too primitive, not only for contemporary art, but for art of any era. The artistic image possesses an infinity of meanings, just as life carries an infinity of meanings. An image changed into a symbol cannot be analyzed. When I create my images, I use no symbolism of any kind. I want to create an image, not a symbol. That's why I don't believe in interpretations of supposed meanings of my pictures. I am not interested in narrow political or social issues. That's the whole point. It's just like he says, I never create allegories. He's creating his own world. I want to create images that touch the viewer's soul to some degree. That's why in my films I tell precisely those stories and not the others. So in other words, he is saying, he really is communicating on this very deep level. I am calling that symbolic, but it's symbolic to me on the rock bottom level, the nature of the things which surround us, not the things as they reflect other things, which they do on the next symbolic level up. But the thing itself is, so the dog is a dog, the cat is a cat, the tree is a tree. Right now I have fruit trees out here that are blossoming. And so the blossom is a very specific thing. Now you could say, well, the blossom reflects the newness of the spring and all of these things. Well, yeah, it does. But first of all, you know what it is? It's a blossom on a tree. And it's not just a blossom. It's not only a blossom. It's not simply, for instance, a way of attracting the bees so that, it's not, this is why I don't like people, when people start talking about humanity as just simply a species. Like anything was as simple as a species. I mean, animals are completely mysterious. I mean, the more you look at them, you watch one of these David Attenborough documentaries on animals, and what the heck is going on with these things? They're not that simple. I mean, I watched a moose once give birth. I didn't see that moment. I came along I chased the moose away. There was a small moose calf, about this tall, and the moose calf sat there for 45 minutes and didn't move, with its legs just like really wobbling. And then suddenly it just walked straight into a raging river and swam across it. I'm sitting there going like, how on earth can this do this? I mean, literally, it knows nothing about anything, and it just swam across a river, having the weakest, most spindly legs imaginable. I don't know how it did that. And it got to the other side. And the mother did not return them. It was all alone. So when we look at these things through this kind of scientific lens, particularly egregious is this pop science lens, and we think somehow we understand things when we're always comparing things to, when people are always saying, yes, this developed this way because of evolution, I'm sitting there going like, what in the world are you talking about? It didn't say I'm going to evolve. It just is, you see. And I think that when people say, it developed this as a part of its evolutionary, what are you talking about? It just is so, we've learned this to put the mysteries away from us. Because as soon as we can talk about the biological imperatives and the evolutionary necessities and all of this stuff, all of which is just completely, when I hear people talking like that without paying any attention to the actual mystery of the thing in front of them, I am just like completely, you've lost me. Yeah. I'm not questioning that things evolved. It's a question of, if that's how you're seeing what this thing is in front of you, you're completely off base. This is not the reality of the thing in front of you. It is H2O, not water, Tarkovsky goes on here, and this is, I think, this is my last quote from him. And some of the, occasionally the language, I might stumble on it because it was translated from the Polish. So so things are completely turned inside out. It was like Russian to Polish, It makes no difference to me, Tarkovsky says, how the public receives and interprets my films. I make films in such a way as to create certain spiritual state in the viewer. Now, that's interesting. He says, it makes no difference to me how the public receives and interprets my films. I make films in such a way as to create a certain spiritual state in the viewer. Is that a contradiction? No, I don't think so. Again, Tarkovsky recognizes that when you make the artistic image, you're making something like a tree. So when you look at a tree, you don't sit there and say, oh, the trees are just for shade. That's why trees are there. No, they're not. I mean, that's one of the things they do. The trees are there for the birds. No, they're not. I mean, they are certainly there for the birds, but that's not why they're there. It's like saying, sex is for procreation. No, sex is not just for procreation. Sex is there for other reasons as well. Everything has multiplicity of meanings. Some of those we see in a highly symbolic way. Others, though, it's so deep that we can't explain it. Why does a person get attracted to one face and not another? Good luck. And yet I think there are symbolic reasons for it. That is to say that for some reason that face relates to other faces one has seen when one was younger and could not explain it. You don't remember why. Or as you go on, that this face is related to a certain kind of feeling, a spiritual state. So I think Tarkovsky recognizes that his art is a spiritual thing. He is making it in such a way that this is what he's put into it. Now, how you interpret it, that's up to you. But he knows what he has done. Exactly what that spiritual state is. He says, as a result, let's see. Okay, so he's talking about the viewer. He says, as a result, he cannot remain unchanged after watching the film. But what the viewer thinks of my film style is unimportant to me. Viewers search for meanings as if this was some sort of charade. And again, I think he's really reacting to the Russian kind of obsession with allegories, and they're looking to see, are you saying really this? To which Tarkovsky would say, no, that's a dog. Yeah, that's the dog I see. This is how I see dogs. Dogs are mysterious to me. And I'm just trying to put you the dogs I see. And his dogs would be very different than my dogs or your dogs. But what the viewer thinks about my film style is unimportant to me. Viewers search for meanings as if it was some sort of charade. I know of no work of art whose meaning would be clear to the degree demanded by some. When they listen to music, read a novel, or watch a play, they frequently encounter fragments they don't understand. It's a normal state of the relationship towards a work of art. But when they go to the cinema, they demand complete clarity, total understanding. I am against discrimination in art. Clarity is not most important. The world created by an artist is as complex as the world that surrounds him. And I think this is the key. And we're going to end this here. What Tarkovsky is saying is that the world around us is mysterious. I am reflecting that back to you with my art. I am creating something which comes from my very specific, unique vision of things, as any artist does who's worth anything. Now maybe there are Hollywood hacks who don't, granted, because these films are sometimes made by committee. But nevertheless, I think that the artist, and he was completely against commercial films. I mean, violently against commercial films. And I'm not saying he was right on all of his opinions, as I am disagreeing with him here. Nevertheless, it is through Tarkovsky's films and later his writings that I began to have a very different understanding of the world around me. And sometimes in Alaska, where if I walked 100 meters off the road, I would be in nature. And I don't mean nature as, like, it's not like being in a park. I mean, I'm talking about you better keep your eyes and ears open now because anything can happen in nature. And I remember one time walking along this one path, and I decided to do it kind of a Tarkovsky walk. And I'm just looking and listening to everything. It's just amazing when you just open your eyes and really start looking at things, what you will see and feel. And all of a sudden, this black shape jumps up about 20 yards off and runs away. And it was a bear, a black bear. We have brown bears too. If it was a brown bear, I would even be a little more, shall we say, aware. But it was a black bear. But I said to myself, well, that's the end of that walk for the day. But not that I never did that again. Of course I did. It's a great way of seeing the world, taking a Tarkovsky walk, where you really look at the things, you really see the things. And that's what part of what his films have taught me, that there is more always to what we see than what we do. That when I used to live in New York City, I would see a weed growing out of the side of the bricks on the side of a house. That would be like my nature for the day, because it's just like, oh my goodness, look at that. Because we have created a world in New York City designed to kill nature, and here it is trying to take it over again, one brick at a time. I think that the lesson I get from Tarkovsky and his fractious relationship with symbolism is, one, allegories where this really equals that, they have their place, but they're not the highest form of symbolism. Next, the kind of symbolism that sees all of the different shapes that relate to other shapes, the forms that relate to other forms, the fact that, you can look at a lion and get these different images from it, that different people have created these symbolic relationships. I think that's another level in. But I think Tarkovsky's layer is at the bottom. And that is to say that these things that we find ourselves living in are far more than popular science has allowed us to see, far more than popular media has allowed us to see. And in fact, we live in a time where the media has, and that we have actually created things to kill the meaning of the things around us, because that is what we actually believe. Next week, or next time I do talk about symbolism, I will quote you from Owen Barfield, where he talks about the images and how we can create whatever we imagine. But that doesn't mean that's a good thing. Imagination doesn't equal good, because there have been great tyrants in history with great imaginations who have created really evil things. That's not good. So I think what I'll do next time is, in fact, I was asked about, well, what do you really think about Owen Barfield or Rookmacher or Peterson or Peugeot's ideas about symbolism? I think I'll discuss those a little bit more, specifically their ideas and how I look at them. And down the road from that, I also want to discuss at some point the symbolist art movement from the late 19th century, early 20th century, which I am highly interested in and have been researching for years, as well as there's probably other stuff. And if you have any, like I say, I'm just kind of doing this conversationally because I'm kind of building up my ideas. And if you have any symbolist, symbol-oriented questions, you can ask them below. And what are your takes on what Tarkovsky is saying here? Do you think I'm interpreting him correctly? Do you think I've completely missed it? Whatever you have to say, share it. And, I would really appreciate it if you want to support this channel. A good way to do it, well, there are several good ways. A painless way is simply to hit that subscribe button down below. Doesn't cost you anything, doesn't do much, except it builds my subscriber count, which might allow me to monetize my videos someday, once I get over 1,000 subscribers. Do you see 1,000 subscribers down there? No? Why don't you subscribe? 2, you can like it and share it. If you like it, tell your friends about it. Say, oh, this guy's doing, this is an interesting discussion. If it's interesting to you. If it's not, hey, do not share it then. Next, you can actually, I'm going to have to try to bring my very, very heavy library in a container from Alaska all the way across the world to Georgia. I want to try to do this by the end of the year. And if you want to help me, you can support me. Anything you do will go eventually towards this goal of trying to get this stuff here. So you can do that through PayPal. And if you do support me, I will pass on some extra material for you to listen to, MP3 files. And eventually I'll probably do some extra video material for you to get as well. And you can do that by either a $10 a month plus donation, or you can do one time. If you do one time of $50 or more, or accumulation of that, I will send stuff to you. But you can give less too. It doesn't matter. Anything helps. So you can do that through PayPal. I found that the best way. Meanwhile, hey, it's a nice day here in Georgia. It's like the 6th of March, and the weather's like 70 degrees out here. I used to live in Alaska. This used to be summer in Alaska. This is not summer here, so I better get out and enjoy this. This is Byrne, the anadromist, reminding you to swim against the stream and to look at the world around you seriously. And if you see parts of it that are just ugly, remember, we made that. But what are you going to do to make it more interesting and beautiful and full of meaning?
A people without history is not redeemed from time. For history is a pattern of timeless moments.
I've got to keep in some sort of touch with all the loose ends of this dizzy affair, if I'm ever going to make heads or tails of it.